Welcome, and thank you for joining this installment of our webinar series, What's Next for Data Centers in Asia Pacific. I'm Todd Olson, Managing Director of our North Asia Operations and Head of the Asia Pacific Data Center Practice Group for Cushman and Wakefield, working with my colleagues in countries across the region. As we all know are involved in some capacity, the dramatic acceleration of global data center expansion is upon us in Asia Pacific. With high power consumption and the corresponding carbon footprint in the sector, there is a drive and need to strengthen sector-wide standards for sustainable operations. This is the first in a two-part series focused on sustainability in this sector. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists today. Kevin Imboden, Senior Research Manager at Cushman & Wakefield covering global data center insights, joins us from the Bay Area to moderate today's session on the sustainability imperative for data centers. And now please join me in welcoming our panel of subject matter experts and global data center players who are proactively leading and addressing the sustainability imperative. First, we have Joshua Au, APAC Chapter Leader from Infrastructure Masons. We also have Paul Dwyer, Senior Director Development from Xscale Asia Pacific. And some of us know that's a JV between GIC and Equinix. And finally, Professor Lee, Executive Director, Energy Studies Institute, National University of Singapore. Before we start today, I'd like to remind you all, please input questions at any time during the session. You can click the chat icon in the upper right-hand corner of the screen with the question mark, and we'll try to cover as many of these questions as we can throughout the session. And with that, I'd like to hand over to you, Kevin.
Thank you kindly, Todd. I appreciate that. And just to get everyone excited, we have some of my favorite data center thought leaders here today, and we were having a fun conversation before we went on. So I think we have a lot of special thought process to share with you and a lot of experience to share with you, very varied experience from across different parts of the industry. And I'd like to start with each panelist and go in depth on what they're working on, because I think you're going to hear some interesting stories today. And Professor Lee, I'd like to start with you. I mean, you wear more hats than I can count. You're leading the Energy Studies Institute. You had a spin-off with data center cooling that's been amazing to follow. I guess we could start with the Energy Studies Institute. Let me know all that research you're doing, many lines of research, what you're working on, and how it's already changing the industry.
Okay. Maybe I can sort of give a broader overview of what NUS researchers are working to kind of develop various solutions for the greening of data centers. Yes, I'll provide a few examples. Professor Pravin Linga is actually investigating the use of semi-claret hydrate slurry, which are water-based phase change fluids. Which is a more efficient thermal energy carrier to replace the chilled water as a cooling medium in the cooling system used in data center. Personally, my research group has been developing various high-efficiency air and liquid cooling techniques, in particular novel fin structure that can be incorporated in heatsink, cold plates, and heat exchanger. And my colleagues, Professor Triji Kong, who is an expert in AI machine learning, is actually developing smart control algorithm to optimize the operational efficiency of both air-cooled and liquid-cooled data center. Energy Studies Institute, on the other hand, is more of a energy policy think tank. So our researchers are actually working on policy design and recommendation on how to drive sustainability for data center industry here in Singapore. I would also like to quickly highlight some of the initiatives the NUS is actually leading, right, including the Sustainable Tropical Data Center Testbed, which is a platform for researchers to partner industry players, including hyperscalers and colo operators and equipment vendors to testbed and de-risk innovative and sustainable cooling solution for data center operating in the tropics. So two the more recent initiatives that we've just announced are the Green Modular Data Center, which we are starting the feasibility of recovering free cool energy from the LNG regasification process, as well as the Sustainable Ocean Data Center, which we are investigating the feasibility of actually using the seawater for heat sinking.
And that seawater has gotten a lot of using seawater as cooling and for heat sink. I mean, that's gotten a lot of press lately. I've read many studies about it. Would you be able to speak on how that's progressing and what you've discovered so far?
Mm-hmm. So currently we are actually at the stage of conducting a feasibility study. So we're actually working very closely with Sembcorp Marine, BDX, as well as NUS as a research performer. Yeah, so we're actually divided into different tracks. One of which is actually to really study the efficiency gain associated with using seawater for heat sinking. The other aspect is actually associated with the integration with wind energy sources. So we're actually keen to see whether it's actually feasible to couple the hydrogen or fuel cell for backup power generation, or even integrating floating PVs, right, to the ocean data center.
Get rid of all the diesel gen backup in those cases, right?
Yes.
So as far that happened in the that was also widely reported in the data center press, and that was fantastic to see that there was already getting wide acceptance in the market. Would you be able to speak on that? Because I think that's a direct example of how the research leads to real world applications, right?
Sorry, I think I lost the 10 second, your last 10 second. Do you mind actually repeating?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just interested in hearing more about Coolest DC and how the spinoff worked and how quickly it was accepted by the market. And I thought that was a good example of applied research.
Okay, yeah. So Coolest DC is actually my spin-off from NUS. So we actually specialize in high efficiency and scalable integrated liquid cool rack for data centers. Firstly, the focusing on colo, right? I think that there have been a lot of case studies that were performed by the hyperscalers. But I think to really push for liquid cooling for the mass market, I think we really need to partner with the colo. So we are now actually doing a test bedding with digital reality. But I think what is more interesting is actually not so much to me, right? Is not so much the technical test bedding, because that has been proven. I think as Joshua has mentioned in a number of forums, liquid cooling is actually well known, right? It has been in existence for 30, 40, or even longer, right? But I think what's more important to me is really the piloting of the business model that will actually proliferate liquid cooling for co-location the market. So I think that's something that we're actually actively working with digital reality.
Gotcha. I mean, I'd absolutely keep everyone abreast of how that develops, because I think that's going to surprise a lot of people with the efficiency gains there.
Yes.
And I'd like to also move to talk about Joshua. Now, I know you have a day job, but I was specifically interested in talking to you about your role with Infrastructure Masons. And for those of you who don't know, I mean, Joshua will describe this much more eloquently than I will, but Infrastructure Masons is a fantastic industry organization for data center personnel. And, you know, got the hat. I got that. You get a hat like this if you're part of the organization. And so I remember a while back we heard at a meeting, every click improves the future. And that was the part of the sustainability action plan, how the organization was going to advocate for sustainability in data centers. And so I'd love to hear you describe what that means from an IMAS's perspective.
Sure. All right. Joshua here. Thanks for having me. In my day job, I do some very mundane things. Outside of it, in my capacity as the chapter lead for IMASs in Singapore, we talk to different ones, operators, policymakers, and several others. What we are trying to do is simply to emphasize that we understand industry needs to do what industry needs to do, but we also want to advocate that let's do it in a manner that is sustainable. And to do so, we want to go for some of the low-lying fruits. Things like, should we have common procurement templates? Because it's not the people in the board who are saying no. It's not the people in the facility saying no. But when it comes to procurement, would the procurement folks know how to procure something that is truly green, that gives due weightage to, shall we say, sustainable practices? It's not fair to expect procurement officers to know what to do. We are trying to harmonize the language. We are trying to get people together to speak with the same terms of references. We are working on a sustainability framework of sorts. And I think more about that will be shared within the next 2 weeks at one of our global members summit. So suffice to say that what we are trying to do is to bring different ones together, be it academia, industry, policymakers, and to try to have a common language to say, let's have a serious conversation. Let's see what we can do with shared common interests to further the green agenda. Let's try to do that. And we've said this in many other conferences. What's the best thing we can do is to first change our own behavior. And when we speak with others, the person to our left, the person to our right, if we get them to have a serious thought about the same issues, and they start to have that conversation with their staff, with their colleagues, with their management, that's where we could proliferate and cross-pollinate ideas. So that's the multiply effect that we're going for. And I don't think there is one single way to achieve the outcome. Different strokes for different folks. So the Green Grid has done good work. The OCPF, the Open Compute Project Foundation, have done good work. All we're trying to do is to complement some of these conversations.
Right, and I think that's an interesting point you brought up, right, about behavioral changes, and I think involving those who may not be usually part of the supply chain discussions, because I think when people in accounting are looking at a number on a sheet, they don't understand what goes behind that. You know, there's no carbon reference, there's no understanding of, there's just a cost and a receipt, and that's about it. And so I think just education, right, that's a part of it, right?
Maybe to add just a casual afternote to that conversation. So I think all of us are aware of the IPCC report. A good example of what I think is good advocacy. A friend of mine, a week after the report was released, she gathered some of the friends, spoke to someone who contributed to the report. They went on Instagram Live and they explained the report in layman terms to the audience. That was the first of these conversations, and at a subsequent conversation again on Instagram Live, she managed to get two ocean climate scientists to come together to discuss the same issues, a different aspect of it, but from the ocean perspective. You know, I mean, when we read on YouTube, we read on Instagram, we understand the impact of kelp forests, mangroves, but how exactly does that affect us? And what can we do as individuals to be part of that conversation and to do our little part? See, when a little girl, or she's not too little, but when someone goes out and says, let's do something based on what I can do, because there's a lot of existential fear and anxiety. But I think individuals can do a lot. And when you have one individual affecting others and they in turn do the same, that's where we get that multiply effect. And that's what I think we really need. We need academia like PS. He's doing great work in his sphere. And there are many who are not scientists. They are not in industry, but they can contribute in like. So we want to get everyone enthused. We want to get everyone thinking about this. And that's part of hitting the last leg of the stool, which is consumer behavior. When consumers change their behavior, that changes the behavior, the decisions, the procurement, and even the way data centers are operated. So ultimately, the end goal is to change consumer behavior. But part of that, we need to have some of these conversations.
No, absolutely. And I think if we can all focus on that as a prime, and I think that report you mentioned was a big eye-opener for people who weren't paying attention. Like, by the way, this is happening right now and there is no going back and you need to pay attention. And so I think that awoke a lot of people. We need to come back to this conversation. This is a life lesson. So I think we'll come back to that a little later too. Paul, I don't want to leave you out of this conversation. From an Equinix standpoint, I mean, Equinix, always well connected, always a top place to be for co-location, and your facilities are getting bigger, and they're getting bigger at the same time they're getting greener. And I think a lot of people would be very interested to see how you're managing that, especially globally, talking about procurement and supply chain. All those questions come up, so I'd love to hear your perspective on all of that.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. It is very much a busy time, and it's striking that balance as both Joshua and Professor have chatted to, in terms of trying to lead in the marketplace from to sort of generate that mindset that change is required, and that we have to strive to be better in the long term. But ultimately, we're in a lot of cases we're building the plane as we're flying it. So when you have a look at particularly from my aspect, the hyperscale side of things, our hyperscale customers drive all of the markets globally, and that's our focus in my group, and just to try and keep up with the scale they require and try and do it in the most appropriate way is sometimes challenging, and it's at Equinix a huge challenge for us, but a challenge that our teams are devoting a lot of resource towards. A lot of our capital raising efforts are also instituting green bonds and things like that to try and underpin, to keep pushing forward and keep progressing. And as you just pointed out, we have added a lot of capacity in the last 2 years, and that means that our shift has to be larger. But we're doing good things. We're progressing. We are hitting our targets. We're very vocal about what our targets are. We're we're wanting people to know. We're wanting people to judge us by our successes in leading that market. So when we're looking at our use of renewables, when we're looking at our building standards and the way we qualify buildings to be a LEED equivalent at the very, very least, we're actively looking at PUEs. Now, PUEs maybe aren't the most accurate thing to use to measure your success, but it is a commonly used practice. So driving across a massive portfolio of in excess of close to 20 million square feet to bring that down to around about 1.5 to 1.52 across that portfolio is a Herculean effort, considering we're adding in excess of 100 to 200 megawatt easily a year. So yeah, some big challenges ahead, but ultimately, like I said, we dedicate a huge amount of our business to this effort across the ESG landscape. Social issues are at the forefront as well, and those initiatives are all bundled together to make things more sustainable moving forward.
Now, I know from our perspective, from a Cushman perspective, more and more of our clients, if they're looking for co-location space, even if they're looking to do ground-up development, this is coming up more and more often. So I think the word is getting out, the focus is getting out, that we need to be looking at the lower PUE. We need to be looking at, and we can get into PUE discussion another time, but the sustainability that needs to happen around the power sourcing and everything else. I'm curious from an Equinix perspective, are you hearing that from, I imagine you're hearing this from most clients, right? That this is a main focus, this is why they're choosing Equinix and so forth, right?
Yeah, correct. And it is a big focus, and it's something that you have to, it's not a matter of wanting to, it's a necessity to be able to show the customer base that you have these initiatives in place and you're planning to be able to accommodate them in the long term. They've all got their own plans. A lot of things center around 2030, and they expect to see that you're working towards those goals. And when we're looking at now, we're approaching 2022 very quickly. We've got products that are very large, and which are going to push us through into sort of 2026, 2027 for build phases already. We have to sort of start really future-proofing what we do right now as we move forward. So yeah, customers are looking at us, but it can be challenging. And Asia Pacific in particular has been, where does that green energy come from? There's some countries that are primary markets for us, which aren't huge users of renewable energies in their grid formations. So it's about looking at it from a design perspective as well, and having the courage and having the ability to try and bring those PUEs in particular, and use of technologies which can be 1%, the 1% stuff, which really helps to push things through when you're starting to think about your cooling types, your resiliencies in the design, but just pioneering new types of cooling and things like that, which is all about efficiency, developing dedicated supply chains for those. It's a multifaceted effort, but we're in a privileged position that we can do these things, and there is an air of expectation from the customer side of things, and they do openly remind you of that along the way.
Well, and in a way, that's good for the industry, right? If our biggest customers are all demanding this, then that puts extra pressure on the rest of us. That we have to up our game, so we'll stay relevant, we'll stay legitimate, and we'll actually make a difference, right?
Exactly. It has to be industry wide, and there has to be champions in that industry. And the two gentlemen that are on this call with me are very much that. But in the operator side, I think that's where the dreams become reality, if I could use that phrase. It's where, in the boardrooms and in the whiteboard sessions, when things are being dreamt up by some pretty clever people in terms of how to use design in the most appropriate way and how you integrate that into day-to-day life. The boots on the ground, the operations teams, the guys that are tasked with making the magic happen, and really putting that customer at the center of what we're doing on the ground. It's just a very much a holistic effort, because the operational standards and what a customer is expecting from a health and safety standpoint is really comes into that as well. Sustainability is multifaceted. It can be defined in many different ways. Obviously, the focus here is more on an energy standpoint, but it's more about that holistic offering, that's for sure.
Absolutely. And I think more and more operators are thinking in this manner, again, because if they weren't thinking about it before, the clients that they want to have in their building are thinking about it. So that's pushing that forward.
Yeah, the larger customers are the ones that need appeasing, and they are the ones who bring the technology. They're powering the digital world. The cloud first ecosystems are what powers us today. It's what's powering this call, and so it's incredibly important to society to be able to maintain this over the long term. So it's about making our technologies match what's needed for the future. But yeah, I mean, look, the hyperscale game is got a tremendous amount of focus in this part of the world, in Asia Pacific. It's a land of startup opportunity. It's a way to become more in the marketplace now, because there is just such a need right across Southeast Asia, and ASEAN is leading the way there. So yeah, there's plenty to do, and there's some guys that are joining the market now. Some startups with some very, very dedicated pathways of doing that, dedicating their entire platform to try and do things a better way. So, I mean, it's fantastic, that's for sure.
So I guess an open question then for all of us. And so we're going to put on our helper hands and think about how we can help some of our other friends that are getting into the industry. Because a big question that we get from our side a lot of times is we have an investor who buys an older data center and then says, oh, wait a minute, this tenant's leaving, this is going to change, or we need to do something here. This isn't what we were expecting. So the question that we get is, well, what's easy? What can we do quickly that'll make a big difference? And I think with the amount of older enterprise facilities that are coming and becoming co-location facilities, this question is going to happen more and more, because this is kind of like these buildings are seeing the light of day for the first time, as it were. So what do we think? How can we help out, and how can we make some quick changes that are going to make a big difference? Well, whoever wants to throw a dart first, I'm all for it.
I think, yeah, you'd obviously have to look at what's possible to do. It's not easy, but ultimately it's an incremental step-by-step process over time. So while you've got access to the ability to be able to do so, you mentioned client move out and things like that, is look at those low-hanging fruits which can be adjusted. Maybe a switch away from large water plants. Obviously, water-based systems are incredibly taxing on the pocket, first and foremost, and they don't deliver the same flexibility that customers are looking for moving forward. So adapting to certainly something that steps away from that. How drastically away from that is obviously up to what people are comfortable to do and what ultimately they can do with the way it's configured currently. but that would ultimately be something where you're seeing the flexibility to go away from that is certainly the easiest thing to do. And if you can, then that obviously goes downstream from there and inside the data hall or towards the data hall when you're looking at that distribution of how you cool the room. If I think back to when I first joined this industry, a decade or so ago, things like flooding a room and just something as simple as in the enterprise world as not using a raised floor was something that was laughed upon and would never ever be adopted, whereas it's commonplace in a lot of cases these days. So I think retrofitting, whilst it's probably cheaper and easier to start from scratch sometimes, but working around customers, I think anything that can be done is certainly starting off in that cooling aspect. That's for sure.
Any other thoughts? We're getting a couple comments in, but I'd love to hear everyone else's thoughts on this subject too.
I'm just going to chime in before Prof. Lee says his piece, and I think it's about perception. If we concede that an old building is no longer as valuable as a new building, but we're not going to trash it. We have to amortize what we have put in. So I think once we have made that mental decision, then we are focused. We don't have to be double-minded about it. And unfortunately, it's not just a technical issue, it's about business acumen. How do you monetize a building that's very, very old, that may not support some of the best technologies, but the fact being, it can support some of it, and there are ways around it. So and I'm thinking out loud, when AWS pushes things like Outpost, Snowball, local zones, because they concede that there are unique use cases that fits certain customers. When you go to Tokyo and you see operators put compute at the basement, which is usually not a good idea, or they put it on a 20th floor, which is usually not a good idea, but they've managed to monetize that. They do it sometimes out of circumstance, but you realize that though it's out of circumstance, they manage to monetize it. They manage to make it into a success story. So I think the devil's in the details. Part of it is in the technology. Part of it is changing the perception, changing, I think, the way the board, the operator decides that we have to be focused about this. Let's not be wishy-washy. If we have to, we have to. But let's agree on how can we do this and yet meet our use cases, and we can ultimately fulfill the business problems. Because whatever solution it is, it has to fit, it has to match the pain points and the business use case. And that is why customers are on board, because they see that this is going to help them.
To add on what Joshua and Paul have just mentioned, I feel that there's a need to periodically review the end user IT equipment specs, the associated rack density, and the cooling system capacity, and actually consider the upgrading to take advantage of more efficient solutions and products. So since my area is actually more on cooling, I'd like to give an example. So for example, we can sort of take a phased approach in transitioning from conventional air cooling systems to liquid cooling systems, right? For example, beginning with a rear door heat exchanger and moving to a fully contained liquid cool rack and ending with full-fledged liquid cooling systems, which results in the largest energy savings and carbon emission reduction. So I think a lot is actually the confidence building exercise. So if you expect, for example, brownfield or old data center to change overnight, right, from a very inefficient to highly efficient kind of the operation, I don't think that's going to happen. So you really need to take a phased approach so that we step through together with the operators, the end user, right? So that you actually build out the confidence, right, and actually approach the greenest possible data center configuration.
Right, and in doing so, maybe we avoid any issues with an SLA, correct? If we keep things uptime, all right, which is part of it. But I think that's a very good point, right? Like this, it doesn't always have to be all in one shot. I think that's kind of a perception, but we can do this in phases. We can make it better, and we can eventually get to the same place. And then you can also do it in a more accounting friendly way, I guess, from rent money. So I think that's we get those questions a lot, so it's good to discuss. Couple questions from the audience, and there was a very long question, and I think the comment is essentially, and I'll try to abbreviate here, that the task of those in the data center industry is to read things that are not yet on the page, that is not yet understood by a lot of the people around there, and that this type of thinking is true for sustainability, is that the average user has no real awareness of what needs to change, and that they know that they need to support sustainability in general, but they're not going to change their behavior, and so this is going to have to be kind of led by the operators. So that's an interesting point, and I guess to since it's an operator reference, maybe Paul will throw it to you first, and then we could opine on that too. But I think you've mentioned this already, how you've been changing for the biggest clients, and so I think that's a good point. But if you have any additional comments on that.
Just to reinforce the earlier comments about that, it's an evolution that needs to occur, and from our point of view, I think the byproduct is the customer need, but ultimately there's also what we've established internally as our own targets, which are arrived at by the way we do partner with a few key clients. You would have seen some publications that we've done in recent times where we have partnered, talking about different technologies and the different utilizations of spaces with some of our key clients, and it does allow us to keep evolving. And I think just one of the points that the guys brought up previously was about trying to incorporate things into the mass market when you talk about liquid cooling and things like that, and that's the challenge. It's being able to do it on a mass scale. When you're talking about a liquid cooled rack, that goes back a long way to the mainframe days of what was being done 30-40 years ago. So it's nothing new, and it's probably, if you went to a customer's site, they may be experimenting in all sorts of different ways of utilizing it, but it's for us to be able to, perform in a way that a customer does expect, because there is a cost impact as well. But two, it's being able to do it across a whole hall, a whole row, a whole hall, a whole facility, and doing it appropriately, and that does take some time, but ultimately working and partnering with customers in the long term, there's something that drives that and gets you there, that's for sure.
And that provides that leadership for the industry once again, that we're able to fill in those gaps, right?
Exactly.
And another question that came in from the audience, and I think I've actually heard some I'm sorry, I got booted for a second. Forgive me on my connection there. Going back to the question I started with, the question from the audience: do data centers still require always low temps, or is it more about a steady temperature? And I think I've heard about hot aisle, cold aisle. Is it changing? Is it still needed? I've heard all kinds of discussion around that. So any thoughts there?
Maybe let me just chime in on this. 20 years ago, Sun Microsystems, they pushed out the Sunfire machines, and Sunfire machines were actually pushed to places like Thailand, Indochina. I'm not sure why they did, but they did. And interestingly, though the machines cost an arm and a leg, but they were able to operate in rooms that had no precision cooling, had no condition power. And what that suggests to me is that the engineering for that has been around for decades, but it was never cost effective. Unfortunately, it has to make money sense. Now, having said so, do you still require low temperatures to operate? In my view, uninformed view, you do not need to, but there is a trade-off. Where's the trade-off? I believe the fact that you're in this call, you are familiar with some of the terms of references. You might have read ASHRAE TC 9.9, the fifth iteration makes some mention about this. So I think industry at large concedes that when equipment operates at higher temperatures, it affects the shelf life of the equipment. It affects the mean time for it to break down. It is what it is. If you have a car and you operate it at ranges that it was not engineered for, it breaks down much earlier than it was committed to. So there is a trade-off. Now, having said so, can you operate at high temperatures? You could, but where is the sweet spot where you concede that I can live with this and I can get away with higher temperatures? And what is that comfort level? So, for example, there are so many methods around this. If you talk to our lovely colleagues at NSCC, the National Supercomputing Center of Singapore, where they use things like rear door exchange, where they use things like warm water coolers, and they're using direct chip to cooling. Now, is that the only way? Definitely not. Different strokes for different folks. There are many ways from an engineering perspective to achieve the outcome. There are many ways to remove certain chunks of redundancy to achieve better electrical efficiencies. There are many ways to operate at higher temperatures. Again, the devil's in the details. I don't want to bore everyone. And there are many different parties doing good work, properly with NTU and other partners. They are doing the tropical data center test bit. They are doing admirable work. John Summers, 6RIS, when they are working on modern DC Type 1, they are trying to figure out what are some of the ways we can do certain things. When Nautilus Data Technologies, they use seawater or at least lake water to cool down the equipment or to achieve certain ways of achieving similar cooling outcomes, but with minimal or no wastage of water. The devil's in the details. There are definitely many ways, and if we were to go down that list, it would likely take hours. But suffice to say, yes, you can, but where exactly do you stop? That's where you need to make an informed assessment.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in on this. So recently, the Cooler CZ have actually conducted some testing in a production DC environment. So what we noticed actually, I think beyond the hardware reliability associated with operating with higher temperature, the other consideration is actually in terms of IT performance. So what we noticed actually, even just at 60% loading, right? The servers are supposed to be able to operate, right, at 60%, right? And in fact, they are supposed to be able to operate up to the 100% specs, right? And that's what the end user actually paid for, right? But interestingly, right, because of the inefficiency of, for example, how the airflow is being managed, we actually observe severe thermal throttling issue. So even at 60% loading, right, your chip temperatures are actually approaching 85 degrees Celsius, and that is actually the safety limit. So it's not so much about the IT hardware is not reliable, but it simply cannot perform to the rated performance. So I think it goes back to an earlier point that Paul mentioned. It has to be a holistic assessment. I think beyond looking at the hardware reliability, but also what are the potential implications in terms of IT performance, as well as in terms of your IT power consumption. That's another area that we actually observe, very interesting observation. See, while increasing or raising the supply temperature, right, can actually lead to an improvement or reduction in your cooling system energy consumption, but it can potentially increase your server power consumption. So really, it has to be a holistic point, well beyond just looking at purely the PUE number.
And do we feel that there's a follow-up question from that's in my mind, talking about older systems versus newer systems? I mean, do we feel that rack density has a big difference on that too?
I think for me, rack density will be one of the key factors, right? Because imagine if you were to use like the direct shape cooling or even immersion cooling for a rack that's just having 7.5 kilowatt density. If you do the ROI calculation, it doesn't make sense, right? You will be more than 2 years, right? And most of the colo of end user, based on unsensing, they change their IT hardware every 3 to 5 years, right? So anything more than 2 years simply doesn't make economic sense. So I think the rack density does play a major role in determining what kind of solutions to use.
Absolutely. I think the story will keep changing when everyone's doing 30, 40 kW a rack, and we'll have to consider that. That's coming soon, probably. We have another question from the audience too, and the question says, what are some of the key sustainability considerations that we should include in a due diligence checklist for building data centers? So I think this might be one of our new investment friends who might be coming in here. Any thoughts on the diligence that goes into that?
I can I can take that. It's something that I kind of have to deal with on an almost daily basis all around the place. So I mean, a checklist towards due diligence of building a new data center. I think due diligence is obviously the first stage of what you go through. But I mean, it's an interesting topic, how you go about planning for a data center, and I think the first thing you look at is obviously contaminants, what the site, if it's a greenfield site or if you're disposing of a brownfield structure or something like that. What was it previously used for? What's been the history of any contaminant exposure over time, and how would you best deal with that appropriately? Because ultimately, wastewater and things like that, and the generation of further problems down the track is something you want to avoid. So that's first and foremost what you want to be having a look at from an environmental standpoint, and that's something that is pretty commonplace in all construction type activities when you're looking at seeing what's underneath you and seeing what you'll be sitting on the way through. From there, if you're looking at it from an energy standpoint, surveying the grid that you're connected to, and what things are being done locally to procure energy, which might be more renewable based or green, and from there, obviously decisions can be made on anything you might want to do locally in terms of on the site. When you're finding you're going to some North Asian metros and more metros around the region these days, a lot of the local bodies will have some fairly advanced thoughts around what your building should resemble, what it should be looking to engineer from any usage of PV panels or looking to generate power on site, or use of fuel cells, use of strategies that can reduce any emissions and things like that. So, I mean, where you're building is going to lead you to a few of those examples as well. From there, as you progress into your design, you're going to be looking at, again, what is the commonly used practices around building code, and whether it's neighbours in Australia, whether you're looking at obviously LEED, fairly prevalent around the place, and so from an architectural standpoint, there's many things you can do there to look at reducing that footprint, and what it's going to from there. As you progress through your design, each design will be individualistic, and there's certain things that you'll be able to bring into that design from you would class that as maybe being part of your due diligence, but ultimately it's business decisions most of the time. It's what you're looking to attract, what you're looking to achieve from your business standpoint, and ease of operations, incorporation of new technologies down the track, being able to give yourself ultimate flexibility and future-proof yourself, really.
Absolutely, and I think that's going into that deep stage at the very beginning saves a lot of trouble later on. And I think for some new funds that are trying to deploy capital quickly, there's almost that imperative to get it done rather than to take the time at the beginning to think this through, right? So just a comment I've noticed here and there. I think we had some commentary from the audience complimenting Professor Lee's comments on running IT equipment at higher temperatures. Thank you. Also, I guess moving sort of back to something we talked about earlier, I think a good item to discuss is how, as an industry, we've talked about doing this sort of holistically and trying to come together. I think there's so much more we can do with like planning departments, with power companies, the utilities that are being to this. How do we continue to build toward that and work together as an industry? I mean, what are some thoughts around that, where we can just keep going bigger and bigger and just involve more and more parties so this is more seamless? I know this is a big thought segment, so I don't mean to frighten everyone with this, because we can brainstorm a little bit.
I'll give it a try, and I think it has to start with aspiring to do better, coming to the realization that we must do it. It's not a should we, it's must we. If you talk to customers who say, should we go to the cloud? That means they haven't hit that point of realization. That's why they're wishy-washy. When they say, I'm going to do it in 6 months' time. We need to reverse engineer how to get to the cloud in 6 months' time. These are the folks who make the painful trade-offs, who make the painful decisions and say, since I've made that commitment, even if I don't get all of it right, I don't have all the right answers, I would simply push ahead, pivot, and make it happen. I think when everyone concedes that we must do this, the conversations are vastly different, because these are conversations at a regional level. By regional, I'm saying governments talking to each other, industry bodies talking to each other. I like what Olson Ireland does when they bring in IDA, they bring in IEA, when they bring in lots of very interesting characters to come together to have some of these conversations, because it's about all hands on deck. When you have academia, esteemed figures like Prof. Lee, when you have policymakers, when you have industry leaders, when you have industry bodies coming together saying, we need to do this, it needs to make sense from an industry point of view, it needs to make money sense because someone has to foot the bill, it has to be acceptable to the consumers and the end customers. And academia needs to back this up. When all these people come together and they say, yes, we agree on the language, we agree on the outcomes, we agree on the timeline, let's make it happen. It will happen. So I think what Prof. Lee is doing with the test bed, that is a perfect example of what we mean by academia, policymakers, industry, and concerned parties coming together saying, let's make it happen. If we need to put in money, resources, dedicated time, and we have the political will to do this because we are determined it will happen. So granted, the devil's in the details. We're not giving you a 20-page playbook, but suffice to say, it starts from aspiration to having clear action, concerted, clear action.
And the must part of that is first and foremost, I think, what needs to be understood. And I think, again, we're finally getting to that point.
I would like to add to Joshua's point. I think I think once you created such right to get the relevant stakeholders to come together, I think that the other aspects actually we really need to be open in the sharing of data and best practices, right? So that the whole industry can actually steer in the right direction, right? Approaching the green data center vision. So I think that the industry players will kind of have to be receptive to the concept of the sharing of resources and outcomes. So I think that's something that we hope the Sustainable Tropical Data Center testbed can achieve, right? Really to bring the industry together, yeah, and actually be open about sharing various know-how, best practices, as well as the associated results.
And I think you've hit on a particular pet peeve of mine as well. That's the heavy NDAs we put each other under when we all have the same goal largely, and we're all quite honestly going to make a lot of money here. I think we need to remember that there are bigger goals in mind, and so I think we have to get there, right? Definitely agree there. We have a comment from the audience, which I think is a good point, and we might be covering this in our next webinar as well next week, but talking about how the IT equipment manufacturers, the chip manufacturers are rarely a focus, that a lot of this is on cooling, power optimization, rather than talking about how to optimize at the chip level. Now, I know that isn't the day job per se of any of us, but do we want to take a swing at discussing that, or?
I think it's important, although the chip makers probably won't sort of talk to, like, for example, the DC, the solution vendors or researchers directly. But what is interesting is just I mentioned about the thermal throttling issues, right? But if you refer to the spec sheet issued by the chip makers, right? Be it AMD, the NVIDIA, or Intel, actually all these data are there, right? But it's just I think a lot of the solution vendor may not necessarily fully appreciate some of this implication, right? In terms of, for example, your chip power consumption penalty if you were to operate at high supply temperature, right? Also the trade-off in terms of your IT performance or your chip performance. So I feel that it's necessary. We should actually bring the chip manufacturers to the table, right? So that we can actually discuss, right? It's not just the back-end power and cooling infra, right? It's also the component level innovations, right? So there are things that we can do. For example, can we look into an integrated heat straddle, right? That will enhance, for example, the performance under immersion cooling, right? So that you can achieve an addition delta in terms of the temperature reduction, translating to additional power consumption savings for the chip or server. Yeah. So I think it's necessary, but we have to figure out, so how do we actually approach them?
Well, I think that has to be from the client level, right? If the biggest clients are pushing for it, that's going to happen. I think there's also that other part of it, which is that some of that at the hardware level there can be controlled by software with better AI, better use of AI, more intelligent machine learning of when certain workloads are needed and when they're not. I think that's all going to be very helpful as part of this, right?
If I could just make a casual comment that I think the likes of Intel, they are partners, well, in fact, they are key partners with the Open Compute Project Foundation, where they've been talking, well, for 10 years about improving the efficiency of equipment, not just the server chassis, but also even the network equipment as well. So I think there are these conversations, and there are associations and forums where the equipment manufacturers are coming together to discuss, to debate, and to appraise the best ways forward. Of course, I concede the devil's in the details, but I think there is a lot of admirable work that is being done.
And especially, it's another concern, like we were talking about rack density earlier, when we were talking about speed of the processor and how much that's going to change things and driving the efficiency that way too, I think. So if with some of the chip manufacturers, again, we're talking about them like they're here, but they're not. I think with they're such a big part of this, and they're under a lot of pressure to continue to perform too. I think that they're under so much, their shareholders are demanding, oh, you didn't release this at a quicker time, the processor didn't get that much quicker, then you may lose market share, things like that. So I think that's a particular challenge for them, and then integrating into everything else we've talked about and that we're working on is a very difficult part. So I think too, I guess as far as working together, though, we're going on many different levels. I mean, there have been some interesting discussions I'd had recently with around raised floor and cooling, and is that really necessary? Is that not really necessary? And then talking about, well, you can't build in some cases a tier 4 build anymore because of the cement, when the cement is not carbon neutral. And that kind of discussion. And these were just things that blew my mind because, again, we tend to focus on certain aspects that we're very familiar with, but this is an entirely different level. Have we seen anything around building materials in the environment that could be a change here? Because I think the more innovative cement was something that blew my mind, and I was just thinking, okay, what else can we do that's going to be for the built environment that'll completely change from the outside in, as it were?
Maybe I'll make a quick comment about how Microsoft is partnering with someone to have its embodied carbon calculator. So when it builds its facilities, with the help of an external friend, they are trying to appraise, is this the best way forward in terms of the embodied carbon? So there are efforts, and I think they are not the only ones working in this space, be it in terms of materials, even when we talk to the likes of DME in Germany, and they talk about the wooden modular data center. They're not the first to talk about using reinforced timber to build data centers. And just if you think about it, when I think Henry Ford first decided to build a car, some of his initial designs were made out of wood. Is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? I'm probably not the best person to make that informed assessment. But I think the devil's in the details that we have to be ready to take some calculated risk. We have to be ready to try new things, because if we don't, then we wouldn't have things like your 2N power supply unit. that happened because someone had a great idea and industry said, let's take a calculated risk to adopt it. And that's the basis of why we have the likes of the Uptime Institute, because with that mentality, then we're able to discuss how can we further improve the resiliency levels.
And I think that goes for a lot of commercial property, which may be of interest to our audience too. The office buildings, apartment buildings, high rises that are now being built with wood frame. And years ago, that would have been just not contemplated because of structural issues. But now, better design, better coating on the wood, more thoughts around it, right? So certainly. Well, at this point, I think we've covered a lot of ground, and we've gone on and off our original script and shared a lot of ideas. So I'd like to pass it back to Todd, who's going to close this out.
Great, thanks, Kevin, and to our panelists for a great, stimulating discussion. Appreciate you sharing your valuable insights, thoughts, and experiences, and giving us all an idea how we can be and contribute to the sustainability imperative and do our parts as moving forward. I think, as it was said by the panelists, this is not a want to, it's a necessity as we move forward. It'll be incremental gains over time, and it's not just a one-step process. So all of us characters, everyone in the industry working together, having that dialogue, that's going to be very important kind of as we move this forward. I'd like to remind everyone that there'll be a replay of this webinar that will be sent out by email and updated to our website. Everyone can access that via the QR code that you can see on the screen now. Apologize, I know there were a few audio difficulties early in the webinar. Can assure you that the replay will not have any problems and you can pick that up. We also hope that you'll register for next week's webinar, part 2. It'll be held at the same time next week, October 21st, on driving efficiency in the data center environment. And again, if you haven't registered already via the QR code, you can go to the landing page and register there as well. And finally, we'll be making a summary report on both today's webinar and next week's webinar, and we'll release that to all participants after that session next week. So thanks again to our panelists. Thank you all for joining, and have a great day.